Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream Fisher by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Bowen, and today we'll be discussing his book, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Well, it's good to have you back to the podcast, Dr. Bowen. It's been a couple years,
Yeah, it has. Thank you for having me.
of course. So let's get right into it. So the Old Testament has several rules about slavery. In the circles of Christianity, it's hotly debated about what did the Old Testament mean by slavery. Some try to work around it by saying it's not exactly what it sounds like. But in your book, you point out that it is exactly what it sounds like. And not only that, but it has a lot of parallels with Mesopotamian law, like the Code of Hammurabi, when it comes to slavery. Now, are the parallels pretty exact, or are there differences?
That's a complicated question. So, because we have um, more data from the ancient Near East, we have a number of law collections going back into the third millennium. Um, there's going to be, or there is, uh, generally speaking, more that these law collections say about slavery. And that's because when you take the laws of Warnama and the laws of Eshnuna and the laws of Lipit Ishtar and the laws of Hammurabi and blah, 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 and you look through them, you're going to find, as you would imagine, more being said about the topic of slavery than just if you look in the laws of the Hebrew Bible. That being said, um, where they do overlap, and there is a fair amount of overlap. Um, Bruce Wells has written about this, and also I think Dylan Johnson wrote about it a little bit in his book as well. But this was an idea that Raymond Westbrook and also, again, as I said, Bruce Wells, they talk about how there's a similar way of thinking about the law and about how the law handles certain situations. And so they make comparisons between the problem that's being addressed and how it's being addressed, and then the actual solution that's set up for that. So, with all of that sort of background being said, yeah, there's a lot of similarity when you do see overlap. Um, and we can get into specifics if you like. There are places, for example, like in Exodus 21, 28 to 32, with the ox, the goring ox law. That's sort of a law that is seen in several different collections, and there's you know uh, a lot of overlap, very specific overlap in many cases. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of similar legal reasoning. Um, Again, just the way they come at the law in the different situations that are being addressed. It's a lot of similarity, not just in slavery, but in other laws. So
Before we get further into the specifics, I want to take this super chat question real quick from How About a Taste. Thank you for your super chat. Does John McHugh's theory of biblical stories being based on creative mistranslation of cuneiform star charts hold any weight?
I don't know who John McHugh is, um, but and astronomy and astrology uh, in the field of cuneiform studies is certainly a sub-discipline. It's something that people spend their careers on. So I wouldn't feel comfortable going into detail about like astrolabes or anything like that. That being said, um, the texts that I've looked at that fall into that category can be fairly terse. Um, so I would be uh, hesitant to think that biblical stories are just based on those types of texts. But again, having not looked at them, uh, particularly with an eye toward that question, I wouldn't want to go on the record. What I will say, I suppose, is there's certainly a great deal of creativity that's brought to bear with the biblical stories, and they, I think, unquestionably, um, in many cases, are interacting with, at a minimum, oftentimes polemicizing Mesopotamian texts. And one text that we see interacted with quite a bit is the Enuma Elish, which is the creation story, one of the creation stories that involves the ascendancy of Marduk. Um, and at the end of that text, there is an entire section where um, the scribes are playing with the name Marduk, and they create through and moving different signs around and using different sign values. They create 50 different names for Marduk. And so this idea of like playing around, creatively mistranslating, is certainly a thing, if that's what how about taste is, if that's what they're referring to. That's certainly a thing. Uh, is that what's happening in the biblical text? Again, I'd want to know more specifically what the question is addressing, but um, yeah, I think it's what I experience, or what I have seen more, is sort of polemicizing, particularly in the early chapters of Genesis, earlier Mesopotamian texts. So,
All right, so let's go into the specifics. In what ways does the Old Testament laws parallel the Mesopotamians, and what are the differences? And not just in slavery, but also in other details that you were alluding to earlier.
yeah, the big broad question. Okay, so let's start with slavery, and I certainly won't be able to just off the top of my head come up with all the different parallels. But if you think of anything in particular, we can go into it. But just sort of walking through, um, the first major section in the Hebrew Bible that deals with law, Exodus 21. The law there, talks about in 2 to 6. It says that if a male debt slave comes in, he is to only serve for 6 years, and he is released in the seventh. This idea of someone going into debt and selling themselves as a debt slave, or handing someone else over as a debt slave. Uh, to be specific, there, I guess the head of the household, the father, in the ancient Near East, has control over his family, his children, his slaves, his wife. Um, and so he can, if he goes into debt, he can say, all right, my daughter is going to go and be a debt slave, or my son is going to go be a debt slave, or my wife is going to go be a debt slave, or my slave. Um, and so the way that the law deals with it in Exodus 21 is that if you're an Israelite and you go into debt and you sell yourself as a slave, you're going to serve for 6 years. And at the end, that's going to take care of the debt and any other potential interest that would have accrued, or, fees for room and board, anything that debt slaves could be charged with. That would all be taken care of at the 6 years of service. Uh, we see something incredibly similar in the laws of Hammurabi. I think it's 116 or 117. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember these off the top of my head. And the distinction, though, is that in the laws of Hammurabi, that duration is only 3 years. So a person is, given as a debt slave, and they serve for 3 years in the house of the creditor, and then the debt is, uh, fully paid off, and they're released. And so, again, similar thinking, similar, rationale. The way they deal with the tech, I mean, the way they deal with the problem is very similar. But the duration here is halved in the laws of Hammurabi when compared to the Hebrew Bible. Um, Also similar in that particular law, if the law stipulates that if a male debt slave comes in, um, and he is married, he's single when he comes in, he's single when he goes out. If he's married when he comes into debt slavery, he's married, his wife goes out with him. But then the text says if he comes in single and his master gives him a wife, then the wife and any children that they have remain the property of the master. They don't go out. They're not released when the male slave is released. And this is also seen in the ancient Near Eastern law collections. I won't be able to pull these off the top of my head. Sorry. I think we see this one in the laws of Warnama, but something similar might be four. I can't remember, but the idea is that just because uh, a a slave gets married and the one partner one part of the couple gets released, that doesn't mean that the other slave gets released as well. So again, similarity in these. And again, Bruce Wells in a 2000, I think it's a 2008, 2009 article, What is Biblical Law, goes through three of these examples. And so it's a really good read. Of course, I go through them in my book. That's the second edition that's coming up as well. Um, so those are the sorts of things that we see. There are also, what we see in Exodus 21, 7 through 11 with an Amah, a female slave, a daughter being sold as a female slave to pay off a debt. Again, this is something similar, just we see not only in the law collections, but also in legal texts that are extant from the periods under investigation in Mesopotamia. Something that we don't see, I guess, to cover that, is Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16, which talks about a runaway slave. And this is one that comes up, of course, in apologetic arguments or discussions all the time. The text says, essentially, if a slave escapes from his master to you, you're not to oppress him. You're not to keep him as a slave for yourself. You're supposed to let him dwell, wherever he wants to among your gates and your cities. And you're not to return him to his master. And so apologists will often read this and say, well, gosh, this sounds a lot like as long as a slave escapes from his master, he can't be returned. And so, as bad as slavery might have been, or even if it existed, if the slave could just get away, the law said you're not allowed to return them. It's not really what the law is dealing with. It's most likely engaging with the idea of treaties that were set up between two countries, and they would often have extradition clauses. And I give several examples in the second edition of the book of this. But essentially, what Deuteronomy scholars think Deuteronomy is doing, and there are reasons for it, saying that you're not to have extradition treaties, you're not to have these types of agreements with neighboring countries where if their slaves escape to you, that you return them to them, and so you're supposed to just sort of take a hands-off approach. So this is most likely talking about foreign slaves that are escaping into Israel across the border. They're not to be returned. They're supposed to just be able to stay wherever they want. We don't see a law like this in Mesopotamian texts, as far as I know, and I've looked pretty extensively of late. But it's one of those things that it's people draw attention to it. Like this isn't paralleled. There does seem to be something similar, possibly in the laws of Hammurabi, Law 87. It's a broken law, and I go into this in the book. But it seems like there might be a parallel that suggests that you're not supposed to return a slave to a master that's abusing them. But I won't spoil that too much. But So I think those are, from a slavery standpoint, those are some places that you can see comparison. Outside of that, a good example that I write about in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2, is looking at laws on rape and adultery. And I do a comparative analysis between what we see in the law collections in the ancient Near East and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. And they're essentially in step with one another. So, if you commit adultery, the person the person that can commit adultery in a relationship, or I guess it's better to say it this way, adultery was considered to be a crime against the person that owned the sexual rights of the woman. So, uh, if a husband went out and had sex with a prostitute, that would not have been considered adultery because it's not a crime against, like, the prostitute doesn't have someone that holds the rights to their sexuality. So, um, rape was a crime against the husband or against the father, and this is both in the Hebrew Bible and in the wider ancient Near East. Penalties were more severe for someone who raped someone who is married, a woman who is married or betrothed, like an inchoate bride, um, than they were against someone who raped a virgin who was unbetrothed. And again, consistent throughout the law collections and in the Hebrew Bible. So if you look at, for example, Deuteronomy 28, 20 or 22, 28 to 29, if a man finds an unbetrothed virgin out in the field and rapes her, um, it's not the same penalty that you would see for raping a married woman just a few verses earlier. Instead, it's a fine and not being able, having to marry the woman that you've raped and not being able to divorce her. So again, consistency, generally speaking, among the collections. There are places where Hebrew Bible seems a little bit better. Other places that seems like the other ancient Near Eastern laws are a little bit better. All of them do things like care for they try to care for the vulnerable, the weak, the oppressed. That's all something that each ancient Near Eastern ruler is supposed to be doing. So caring for the orphan, caring for the widow, caring for the slave, like these are all in their own way, uh, considered in these law collections. And so while one might be a little better and one might be a little bit worse, when you sort of take it into account, they're all essentially on par for the most part with one another.
I want to shift to what the apologists like to say sometimes, and they'll say that the slavery in the Old Testament isn't really real slavery. It's more like a servitude, or something like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is the problem, I'm sure, as everybody watching knows, is that if you're looking at the Hebrew Bible, if you're looking at the Old Testament as the inspired, inerrant Word of God, when you see something like the rape of an unbetrothed virgin not receiving the same penalty as or punishment as someone who rapes a married woman, or when you see uh, men fighting in Exodus 21 and they strike a pregnant woman and she miscarries, there's a monetary fine. But if the woman is hurt, then lex talionis applies, and that lex talionis doesn't then continue to the slave uh, in a few verses later. When you see those types of things, it's like if we're basing our morality on this text, and it's inspired and it's inerrant, it's very difficult to figure out from an apologist standpoint how to square, Yahweh either outright commanding or simply endorsing practices that we would today consider to be immoral. And slavery obviously falls into this category. And so, one of the ways that this is, sort of engaged with by apologists, as you just pointed out, is to sort of downplay it and to say, oh, well, maybe, I mean, it's a Hebrew word that we're translating here, right? So, Eved, what is Eved? Well, maybe it doesn't really mean slave like we think about it today. And that the process that they tend to go through, in my experience, is they say, well, what do I think of when I hear the word slave? Well, I think of, movies about slavery in the antebellum South, right? Or what I, read about the way that slaves were treated in the antebellum South, which was nightmarish and atrocious and horrific. And so they say, well, gosh, like if I look at Exodus 21 or Deuteronomy 15 or Leviticus 25, the picture that I have in my mind of a slave being mercilessly beaten and starved and abused and murdered, like this is not the picture that I see here being described in the laws of the Hebrew Bible. And so, well, it can't be the same thing. And so once you sort of establish that in your mind, then you can sort of say, well, if it's not that, well, then what is it? But so now they've sort of untethered themselves uh, from the notion that just because it says slave in the English, it doesn't, that necessarily it means that that it's the type of slavery that they're picturing from the antebellum South. And so then, it's no holds barred at that point, so they can read things and sort of make arguments. Well, here's the reality. Uh, that way of thinking starts from a false premise, I think, and the false premise is that slavery means the way that slaves were treated in the antebellum South, right? And if it doesn't mean that, so and what I mean by that is, again, mercilessly beaten and abused and murdered and kidnapped against their will. If it doesn't mean that, the argument goes, then it's not slavery. Well, sorry, that's just not the case. There are many forms of slavery that are all bad. And so what we see both in the laws of the antebellum South and in the laws of the Hebrew Bible and in the laws of ancient Near East is that slavery was holding ownership rights over another person. Right. And the owner benefits from the output or the use of that owned individual. And that ownership could be temporary, it could be permanent, but it didn't have to be kidnapping. It didn't have to be against their will. It didn't even have to be permanent in order for it to be slavery. And so, that's something that I spend a little bit of time on, just like all, other scholars that write on this do, spend a little bit of time talking about definitions. And so what apologists will do in this context is they will go to passages like Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15 and sort of focus in on debt slavery. And they will say, okay. Like, what is the slavery that we see here? Well, it's someone who's destitute, right? They've taken out this loan and they can't repay it. They're broke. And so, what are they doing? They're going to the person and saying, "Hey, I can't pay you back, but like, can I work for you to pay off my debt?" And so this is, what they say, like it's a type of welfare system, right? Um, and what else were they going to do, right? This is what was necessary in the time. All these sorts of arguments. And what they failed to cite and address uh, is that debt slavery is not the only type of slavery that appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the laws of the Hebrew Bible. And by the way, it's bad. We don't want debt slavery. We don't want that. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is that it's still from the moment that it's entered into, it your consent, your willingness to remain as a debt slave is irrelevant. It goes out the window. What do they say? At time T1, it might be voluntary, right? But following that, your willingness, your consent becomes irrelevant. It's like, I guess it's like getting on a roller coaster. Once it leaves you've sat down, you've been locked in. Once that thing leaves, like your consent is no longer required, right? You're going to be on that ride until it ends. And but that's not the only type of slavery that is endorsed. So if you look at Exodus 21, 2-6, the wife, the children, they're chattel slaves, right? There is no debt upon which the slavery is dependent or contingent. The man himself can sign up to be a chattel slave. Chattel slavery is just slavery that's not contingent upon the repayment of a debt. And so he can become a chattel slave. If you look at verses 7-11, what's being described here, even though they would not have considered it as such, what's being described there is sex slavery, right? Because a daughter is being sold as a wife, probably more likely a concubine, to this man who now owns the rights to her sexuality, and her consent is not required, right? And by our definition, this would be sexual slavery. And of course, the famous passage that apologists often just skip over, which is bizarre to me when it happens, is Leviticus 25, 44-46. So trying to remember how I translated it. But as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may get them from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves. You may also purchase the foreign residents, the tenant farmers that are living in your midst, along with their children who've been born in your land. You can keep them; they'll become your property. You keep them as a permanent inheritance. They serve forever, passed on to your children. I've sort of started paraphrasing now because I can't remember the exact verbiage, but your fellow Israelites, you can't treat them with violence. And this is those are damning verses because they are explicitly describing chattel slavery, and so the idea that it's just indentured servitude, first of all, rings so hollow to me. And one of the things that I deal with in the second edition of the book, it's going to be coming out here in a couple months, is I set up this question that you can ask apologists when they make an argument like that, and they come to, well, it's not slavery like we saw in the antebellum South, or it's only indentured servitude. I make the suggestion that you sort of look at them and then say, therefore what? Because that argument, those types of statements are very often, in my experience, attempts to soften slavery and to get you sort of derailed off of the main point. Whereas if you just grant what they're saying for a second, say, okay, let's just say it's just debt slavery. Therefore what? It's okay? Like, you're okay with that kind of slavery? We should do that type of slavery today? It's moral? Is that what you're arguing? Okay, so it's not exactly like what we see in the antebellum South. Therefore, what? It's okay? Like, it's better than the nations around had. It's not, but let's assume for a second, therefore what? It makes it okay? Like, because it's better slavery? Like, well, the penalties for rape were, stronger. They had to pay more shekels if they raped an unbetrothed virgin. Therefore, what? It's okay that was I don't understand. So, these are problems, I think, with the apologetic argument that are glaring in these discussions.
Got a PayPal question. David, thank you for the PayPal money. You can ask Dr. Josh whenever, no rush. But Jehovah's Witnesses' understanding of Judges 11 is that Jephthah didn't sacrifice his daughter. They say that he sent his daughter to serve at the tabernacle for the rest of her life, and that the young woman of Israel would go to give commendation to the daughter of Jephthah's after that. Is there any way this could be a valid reading, or is it simply nonsense?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at Judges 11 in a while, but certainly the text is, arguing or stating that she was killed, right? She was sacrificed, and this was the point. And so, of course, from an apologetic standpoint, whatever position one holds in Christianity, if they're looking at the Old Testament as the inspired Word of God, like that's going to be a problem. How can Yahweh allow that type of vow to go forward? But that's why I think these sorts of arguments come out. I'd be interested to look, because again, it's been a while and I just don't remember. I'd be interested to look and see what rabbinic interpretation of that was, because I suspect that would also be problematic. Looking at the later, rabbinic writings, they probably would have engaged with that. But no, I think the text is pretty clear. She's going to be killed. Which is the tragedy of the story, and it's not an unmatched tragedy. I think in the Book of Judges, of course, if you think to what Judges, Judges 19, where the man's concubine, is raped all night by men until she dies, and then is cut up into. It's just horrible, right? It's sort of one of the things that you see in the Book of Judges. So, yeah, I would say that she's killed. That's the reading of the text.
Does the Old Testament laws about slavery stay pretty consistent, or are there eventually contradictions? Because you talk about that there are parallels between, and we've already gone over some of that earlier, between Deuteronomy's view about slavery and the Exodus's view about slavery.
Yeah. So this is something to sort of set the background to that, because that's a great question. From a more fundamentalist view of the text, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, these would have all, they should all be in agreement with one another from that that vantage point. From a critical historical standpoint, scholars that are coming to the text and doing critical Pentateuchal research, pretty much agree. There are a couple outliers, but I think pretty much would agree that Exodus and the Covenant Code, Exodus 21, that comes earliest. It comes first. Followed then in the late 7th century, probably with Deuteronomy 15, and then the Holiness Code in Leviticus 25 would come last. And so when we look at the laws that appear in those passages concerning slavery, almost universal agreement here that there is development between the three collections. One place that's seen is in between Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, where it looks like Deuteronomy is responding to a statement that appears in Exodus 21, where it talks about female slaves. So, in Exodus 21, 2-6, it says, male slave comes in, serves for 6 years, and he goes out. Then verse 7 opens, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she will not go out as the male slaves do. Um, and it looks like whatever the conclusion is, whatever Deuteronomy 15 is doing, it looks like it is responding to that statement. And there are two ways to deal with what it says. The text, talks about the same sort of procedure with slight variations, but um, this a similar procedure to if a man wants to stay with his family, he can have the ritual done and serve for life. But at the end of it is tacked on, and you will do this also for your female slaves. So that's the interaction. The question is, what is it saying? Is it contradictory? Is it trying to correct something that was there in Exodus 21, or is it addressing it but specifying so that people understand what Exodus 21 wasn't saying? And sorry, I'll be clear. Exodus 21 is describing a daughter that's being sold into concubinage to another man. It's not addressing a general a woman being or a girl being sold just as a general slave who's not going to be a concubine or a wife, at least specifically. And so it's possible that Deuteronomy 15 is just saying, hey, what we're dealing with here is making sure that you know that general female slaves are also to be released after 6 years. It could also be saying that female concubinage is not allowed. You can't sell your Israelite daughter as a female concubine. Or it could just be developing and saying it used to be that they wouldn't get released, but now they do. But in any case, there is interaction between those texts. Now, there is a clear development between those two collections. In Exodus 21, it says they serve for 6 years, go out in the seventh, and they're free of debt. Deuteronomy 15 says the same thing, but then adds, and you don't just send them out empty-handed. You give them all kinds of provisions, food and wine from your wine van, all these things. So that when they go out, ostensibly, it's to try to ensure that they go out and are able to make ends meet and don't have to take out loans and then fall back into debt slavery. That's a clear development in the law. But I think probably the starkest contrast that we see comes in Leviticus 25. And in Leviticus 25, it's developing not only the time, the duration that an Israelite is allowed to be kept by another Israelite when he falls into a state of poverty or extreme debt like this, but also how they are to be treated in general. So in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, the law says you are allowed to take fellow Israelites, buy them as debt slaves, but they serve for 6 years and are released in the seventh. When you get to Leviticus 25, the text says you can't buy them, you can't take them as slaves any longer. If an Israelite becomes so poor that he sells himself to you, you have to treat him as a hired worker. You can't treat him as a slave any longer. So that's a big distinction between the collections. Then the text says, and he gets released at the year of Jubilee. It's no longer a 7th year release because the Jubilee year is every 50th year. So that could mean that one could serve less than a year, right? If the Jubilee year, if you're in like the 49th year and you start serving, you'd get released in the following year. Or if the Jubilee just happened, sucks to be you, right? You could serve for the entire 50 years. So, or 49 years, be released in the 50th. So these are distinctions that we see among the collections, and they seem very intentional. People have written articles about these things, but it seems like they're intentional developments between them and responses to earlier laws in the later laws.
David, thank you for your super chat. Will Dr. Josh be taking his family to visit his pal, Dr. Ken Hovind, at Dinosaur Adventureland this summer? Fun for the whole family.
Yeah, let me tell you. Last thing I'm going to do is let those Bowens down here at Dino Adventureland. Yeah, so but come on down. $49.95. Get you a good ticket. No, likely not. Right. I particularly after, and I haven't looked into all the things that I've seen or heard about that particular uh, dinosaur park and the stuff that happened recently, but it seems pretty awful. So no, but I doubt it was a serious question, but
You can see the laughing emoji at the end.
yes, there it is.
Yeah. You imitate him so well.
I don't know that that's a compliment though. See,
I want to shift for a moment to the New Testament's view about slavery, when Paul mentions in Philemon that he tells Philemon, "Keep Onesimus for me," um, something like that. Is the New Testament's view of slavery the same as the Old Testament's, or are there some differences?
yeah. So this is a complicated question for two reasons. One, it's as I always say, for those who've watched me any amount of time, this isn't my area of expertise. Um, However, I have done a fair amount of research into it, so I'll comment on it as I feel comfortable. I write about it both in the second volume to the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, and in um, the second edition to the Old Testament Endorsed Slavery. So some things to bear in mind. The way the Hebrew Bible is laid out in the legal sections is it's coming from a very top-down approach. So the narrative sets it up as Yahweh is giving these commands and giving them to a people group that is anticipated, at least again in the narrative, to be in charge, in power. If they obey Yahweh's commands, they're going to be the head and not the tail. They're going to be the ones, like you see in Deuteronomy 20, going out and fighting all these cities that are far away from them and making them vassals. And then, of course, annihilating all the people that are living in the land of Canaan. So it's a very top-down approach. And so in that type of context, it's able to give laws like this because they have autonomy, again, as far as the narrative goes, and they can set their own laws. And so they're establishing that way. In the New Testament, the texts are not, in that coming from that vantage point. Christianity is not in a place where it's going to be able to establish these types of laws for something like the social institution of slavery. And so I think that we should bear that in mind. And there's a discussion on several years ago now, but on Shannon Q's channel, Laura Robinson and I went on and discussed this. But that being said, the argument that often comes up in this context is, yeah, okay. So the Old Testament was bad, right? That was actual slavery; it was legit. But the problem is that the law was never intended to be God's ideal for morality. And they go to Matthew 19 to establish this as a principle. In Matthew 19, Jesus is being questioned about the issue of divorce and the laws surrounding it, and essentially says, look, yes, the Mosaic law allowed you to divorce your wives, but that was because of the hardness of your hearts. In the beginning, when God created man and woman, it was not that way. And so that principle is abstracted and said, okay, there are things then in the law that might reflect God condescending to that that current moral state of humanity as a whole, or of the Israelites, and it doesn't reflect the final word on the matter. It's just sort of there to allow them to move another step forward. And so then it's applied to slavery, because from where we stand today in our moral progress, we look at slavery and go, well, that's not good. So if it's in the Old Testament endorsed in the legal sections, this must be another one of these um, types of laws that are given because of the hardness of man's heart. Okay. The argument that I make in the book, that I'll just briefly cover here, is essentially, if that were the case, one, we don't have a direct connection between Matthew 19 and that principle about divorce, if it is a principle, right? We don't have a direct connection there between that and slavery. It's not like he says, yeah, this is also true for slavery. We don't have that. Not to say that that connection can't be made. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're going to make that connection, I think you'd need to see that would be the burden becomes, it goes to the person trying to make that connection. And the struggle that I see with someone making that connection is that we don't seem to see the New Testament in any way speaking against the social institution of slavery, condemning it, certainly not condemning it, but instead, we see it being not only assumed, but utilized in many of the metaphors and in the hypothetical situations that are used in moments of teaching. So the book of Philemon is often brought out, right, as you mentioned, to sort of show here, look, Paul is saying set Onesimus free. Again, I'm not a Philemon scholar, so I'd obviously defer to those that are, but it doesn't seem like there's any consensus behind, certainly not behind, the view that that's specifically what's being talked about here, a slave that is, being urged to be freed by Paul. There seems to be debate about that, but certainly the view is not that Paul is giving some broad condemnation of slavery as an institution. Even in the best case scenario, where this is actually about a slave that has run away, that is being returned by Paul and saying, hey, do the right thing and set him free. This isn't some broad condemnation. And again, I talk about this, show some reasons why, but that's a place where apologists often go to. They also will often go to Galatians 3:28, which is, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. You are all one in the body of Christ, or in Christ Jesus. Can't remember which one. And so this is, well, look, neither slave nor free. Paul is at least laying the groundwork for this, right? He's making clear his opinion, his position on slavery, and it's there is no slave nor free. We're all equal. I don't think that's the flex they think it is, because I think one would be hard pressed if you asked Paul, is there a distinction between Jew and Gentile? Practically speaking, I think he would say yes. And certainly if you asked him, is there a practical difference between in society between male and female? Yes, I think would be Paul's answer. And he, I think he speaks about that quite a bit. So to see this as like a blanket statement showing equality in the concerning the social institution of slavery, I think it's just it just doesn't. But this is about being in Christ. It's a spiritual position that people have. So there are other verses like that. 1 Timothy 1:9-10. I won't mention anymore after that, but is another one that is used where it talks about it's a vice list, and on that vice list of things that Paul considers to be bad, uh, he says slave traders, andropotistes, and or potestai there, I guess, but um, and so they say, well, man stealers, slave traders, this is condemnation then, because it's equating them with these horrible other or other horrible sins, immoral things in Paul's opinion. And so slave trading, slavery is being condemned here. Well, this is talking about slave traders, a very specific part of the social institution of slavery. And this list is not new to the New Testament. It's one that's seen. It's a borrowed list, right? And so one would have to argue that the New Testament, if it's condemning slavery, then elsewhere in the first century, outside of Christian texts, it's being condemned, and I don't think anybody would make that argument. So, no, it's arguing against slave traders and their specific behaviors. One uh, passage that speaks the other way against this, and when I say that, what I mean is I've been saying that these are passages that apologists will use to show condemnation of slavery. If you look at a passage like Luke 17, Jesus is using a hypothetical situation to make a point about his own disciples. And he says to them, which one of you, having a slave working in the field all day, would, at the end of the day, when the slave comes in, say, here, sit with me and eat? No is the implication here. You would say rather, go and make my dinner, like put on your apron and make my meal and wait on me, and then only after I have finished may you then sit down and eat. And after all of this, you still would only say this is a worthless servant, right? This is he's done only what he was supposed to do. So utilizing, and that's one of many that you could pull, even from the book of Luke, that you could pull that show that like slavery is not only accepted by Jesus and the other early church writers, but it doesn't seem like, which one of you, stealing robbing a bank would, it seems like it wouldn't be a good hypothetical to use if what you were trying to say was, hey, don't keep slaves, right? It would be like, which one of you would keep a slave? None of you would, because slavery is bad. So I think these are problems, and of course, I'll land with this, but of course, the early church, if the New Testament spoke out or condemned slavery in some way, it does not appear that the early church picked up on this. And of course, people can read Jennifer Glancy, they can read Ronald Charles, amongst other people on this topic. But yeah, it doesn't seem like the early church noticed that the New Testament condemned the social institution of slavery.
Some apologists try to say that the Bible was not used in much later centuries to justify slavery, but not only in the South during the days of slavery did they use the Bible to justify slavery, but many other cultures did too for the last couple thousand years.
Yeah, I think this sort of leads into something that I talked about in the beginning here, and that is trying to show, when apologists try to show this great divide between slavery in the antebellum South and slavery in the Hebrew Bible. And the way that they do that, intentionally or unintentionally, again, in my experience, is by contrasting what actually happened, the atrocities that were committed against slaves in the antebellum South, in the colonial period, in the post-revolutionary period, in the antebellum South, leading up to the Civil War, uh, and the laws that were on the books the laws that we find in the legal sections of the Hebrew Bible. When you contrast those two, or when you compare those two, yes, um, because we know of the atrocities that were committed against slaves in the South and in the North, but certainly in the South. But I think that this is an inappropriate and for our purposes, an incorrect comparison. I'll tell you why. I think the way that you need to do that comparison is to compare apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges. And the apples to apples comparison would be looking at the laws in the antebellum South and comparing those laws to the laws in the Hebrew Bible. Because what people did to circumvent the laws, or in spite of the laws, or whatever, is different from the laws themselves. And the reason that I think this is so important, I guess I'll get to as after I finish making this comparison, but there's a reason that I think this is so important. What we find, and I wrote about this in the second edition, in the second volume of no, it was in the first. I keep saying second. It's in the first volume of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. But I develop it more in the second edition to Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery, is looking at the laws that were on the books in the antebellum South. And what you find, not only in the laws, but also in the legal rationale that went into the decisions that were made by judges and legislators, is it's a little frightening. It was to me anyway, and it has been to people that I've engaged with on this, in that the laws did not allow slave owners to do whatever they wanted with their slaves. They weren't allowed to abuse them. They weren't allowed legally certainly not to kill them, but they weren't supposed to abuse them. It was illegal to do so. The only physical beatings that they were, I say only, the physical beatings that they were allowed to give them were supposed to only be for moderate correction. And if you read through some of these legal decisions, you'll see things like it would be befitting a good Christian to abuse one's slave, right? Or we must consider their humanity. This type of language is used, and it only gets more humane the closer you get. Well, certain caveats there, but as you move toward the Civil War, the laws tend to get better, more humane, more the penalties get stricter for someone abusing or murdering a slave, to the point that you see laws that say things like, if a man murders his slave, the punishment will be as if he had killed a free white person. And that was shocking to me to read. It's shocking, I think, when people come across that stuff. Now, let me be abundantly clear why I think this is so important. We know what happened in the antebellum South. We know the horrors that the institution of slavery brought to this country. And what scares me is when I hear an apologist say, oh, it's so different from the laws in the antebellum South. It's not. The tension that the judges were and the legislators were wrestling with in the antebellum South was, okay, look, we have to hold in tension the master's right to beat their slave, to give them physical punishment in order to motivate them, in order to correct them, whatever. Then we have to keep that intention, hold that intention with the humanity of the slave. and their right not to be abused and not to be murdered. So how do we do that? And somebody like Judge Ruffin in oh boy, what year was that? It's terrible. Anyway, is it State versus Man? I think nobody should quote me on that, but I think that's where it was. The laws in the American South are not my area of expertise, but like he's got this several page long engagement with his brief, on the decision that he made and why he made it, and like he really struggled with that, but upheld the right of the master to not be charged with battery. And that tension that you see, well, we got to be able to, the masters have to be able to beat them, but they can't be allowed to abuse or to kill them. It's what Exodus 21:20-21 is doing. If a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately, they're to be killed, probably, right? Serious punishment. And the idea here is that, well, if they're killed immediately, this is an indication that they're being abused and murdered. But verse 21, if they survive a day or two, well, master's not to be punished, the other side of that tension, because they are his property. There is money, right? And so again, it's dealing with that same question. How do we balance the master's right to beat the slave and the slave's right to not be abused or killed? How do we balance that? My concern, my great concern, is that when an apologist says there's this great gulf between what we saw in the antebellum South, it leads to something that I heard up till yesterday. Yesterday, I was listening to a room in Clubhouse, and several Christian apologists said, look, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing immoral about slavery in the laws of the Old Testament, because it's these people. What else are they going to do? It's they had to be good to them. They had to not abuse them. They couldn't kill them. Sure, they could beat them. Yeah, okay, yeah, they could beat them. But I mean, how else would they motivate them? Right? These are the things that are being said in these rooms, and that's not uncommon. Why that's so dangerous to me is because it's often followed up with, yeah, I mean, I think if we reinstated those laws today, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. When you see the close connection in many cases between the laws and the rationale behind them in the Hebrew Bible and in the wider ancient Near East to what we see in the antebellum South, believe me when I tell you, you don't want the Old Testament laws reinstated, because we saw what happened when those laws were instated in the antebellum South. We don't want those atrocities repeated, period.
Do you think that they based a lot of their laws on what it said in the Bible and the antebellum South?
I don't know that I have enough. So I certainly haven't done the research required to see how the laws developed. There is a book that I suspect probably wouldn't deal specifically with that question, but would give you the bibliography. And it's the Oxford Handbook to Slavery, I think, in the Americas. I think that's what it was called. But there's an article that I cite quite a bit in the new second edition by a guy named Finkelman. He's got a pretty good bibliography, but so I don't know. In the colonies, when these laws were sort of being developed, what they based them on. I don't have the answer to that. I think you'd probably want to talk to a legal specialist from early America. But Um, what I can say is that the Christian faith and what it meant to be Christian, like adjectively, right? A Christian person, a good Christian person, or like being a Christian person, sort of thing. Um, that certainly came into many of the um, the laws, or the discussions, because again, it's like, like a good Christian wouldn't do this. So the question of like, were they looking at Exodus 21 when they developed the laws? I don't know the answer to that. Um, what I will say though is that whether they did or not, um, there are so many similarities, at least when it comes to the physical punishment of slaves in the antebellum South. There are so many similarities in the rationale between what we see in the Hebrew Bible and what we see in those laws.
In my closing question, I want to circle back to slavery in the Old Testament real quick before we close for today. Um, when you look at how it says in the Old Testament, keeping a slave, domestic slaves from slaves that are foreigners, could you talk about real quick a brief summary of how harsh, how different, let me rephrase it, how much more harshly the rules were for foreign slaves compared to domestic?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of discussion around a specific aspect of this that I'll talk about. Um, but the place that you see this most clearly is in Leviticus 25. And but even if you compare that to Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, where I think it's more severe for. I think Israelite slaves are better off. That's also debated. I'll talk about that, I guess, in a second. But on its face, it looks like Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15 are worse for Israelite slaves than what we see in Leviticus 25. But even there, they're to be kept for 6 years and released in the seventh, and that pays off their debt. Um, they're not even allowed. The text says they're not even allowed to be kept as slaves in Leviticus 25. But um, and this is not unique to the Hebrew Bible, by the way. You look at like the Hittite laws, for example. Citizens enjoy greater benefits than foreigners when it comes to things like this. So I mean, it's not like the Hebrew Bible's worse somehow. That's not the point. But what we see in Leviticus 25 is that the whole chapter leading up to this is about um, giving release or giving respite uh, to the land or to God's chosen people, right? So it deals with Jubilee quite a bit, and the way that it functions leading up to this verses 44 to 46 section is that again, Israelites are, if they do fall into this extreme poverty where they have to sell themselves, they're not allowed to be kept as debt slaves. They have to be kept as hired workers, and they're to be this, to remain with them until the year of Jubilee when they're supposed to be released, not only back to their land, but the land is supposed to be released to them as well. Everything, it's a big reset button. Then it contrasts this with foreign slaves, because the question then becomes, well, if we can't get slaves from our fellow Israelites, where do we get them? And the text explicitly says, as for your male and female slaves, here's where you get them from. Get them from the nations that are around you, and you can get them from the tenant residents, tenant farmers, people that are most likely renting out land from other Israelites within Israel proper. The distinction here is that there is no 7-year law of release. There is no Jubilee release for foreign slaves. these become the Hebrew word there is achuzah, and what it means is their landed property. It's used that way in almost every other case. This is the only place where it's applied to humans. Um, and what it means in every other place is like the land itself, the inheritance that they're given, or the property that they're given. Um, it refers to land, permanent land, real estate. And so its application here seems to indicate that slaves become part of the inherited property. And so what you would expect to see then is that if a man has to sell or pledge a foreign slave to someone else, along with his land, or in addition to whatever, his land, that at the Jubilee, not only does the land return to the Israelite, but also his other achuzah, his other property, which would be the slave. So the point is that foreign slaves do not have this right to release um, that Israelites have, fellow Israelites have. They are not required to be released. They can be kept and made to serve permanently. They can be handed on, passed on as inheritance to the children of the owners. They can be made to serve for life. Now, the debated question is there is a phrase that shows up in verse 4 at the end of verse 46 that says, "But as for your brothers," can't remember exactly how your fellow Israelites, your brothers, whatever, "you are not allowed to rule over them with," the Hebrew word here is the word for violence. And it's the word that's used in Exodus 1:13, where it talks about what the Egyptians did to the Israelites. And it's reasserting this. You see it in verse 43 as well. And you also see it later, I think, in verse 55. But the point is that it seems to say you can do all these things to foreigners, but you're not allowed to rule over your fellow Israelites. The NIV says ruthlessly, or with let's see, another word that's used to translate this with yeah, I can't, with severity, but the word is perech, and it's just like with violence. So yeah, I think Jeffrey Stackert makes the argument up Chicago that this is implicit, that it means that you couldn't do this to fellow Israelites, but you could do it to the foreigners. Some would argue that this is it's not saying that, it's just re-emphasizing that you can't treat your fellow Israelites with this type of slavery. I think probably a safe conclusion at the moment is just to say that all slaves were anticipated. It was anticipated that all slaves were going to be beaten. Right? It was anticipated that all slaves, whether debt or chattel, or pledges or distraints or whatever, were going to be physically beaten in order to keep them in line or to motivate them. So I don't think that would have been any different, obviously, for chattel slaves, particularly if debt slaves could be beaten. But I think the emphasis there, at least in Leviticus 25, is they're not required to be manumitted to be released as fellow Israelites were. They could be made to serve permanently till they die.
We have a closing super chat question. Hey David, thank you for your super chat. My apologies for the amusement park joke earlier. Didn't see the news on it till just now. Thank you both for what you do. You help people like me free our minds and think for ourselves.
Yeah, it's and it's absolutely fine. Sorry, I hope it didn't come across as me like being offended or anything. It really took me. It always takes me by surprise when people seemingly do the things like that. And maybe it shouldn't, but yeah, because I remember it was actually Dr. Kip Davis messaged me about it, because I can't remember what I had said, but I'd said something about Kent Hovind or something, and he was like, did you hear about this? And so you're not the only one that was caught by surprise on that one. I probably should look into it more than what I have, but what I've read, the evidence that I've seen does seem pretty bad. So, but thank you very much for giving that super chat. Very kind.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Joshua Bowen.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And I thank everybody for their super chat questions and everybody that watched the stream. And I'll see everybody later. Thanks again. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.